Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating framework outlined in the American States Assembly documents. Specifically, we're taking an objective, highly structured look at the profound choice these materials present to individuals regarding their political status and, honestly, their whole level of participation in self-government. According to the texts, you've got distinct pathways to choose from when interacting with the state and federal government, and each one carries its own unique set of rights and responsibilities.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit the intro to assembly status, define state nationals, define state citizens, compare their roles and duties, look at assembly service and some common misconceptions, and finally, wrap it all up with a summary.
Section 1. Intro to Assembly Status.
Now, everything we're analyzing today is drawn straight out of the provided assembly documents. And right off the bat, they establish that the absolute foundation of this entire system is voluntary self-governance. Basically, nobody's forced or obligated to join their state assembly. But the texts argue that choosing to participate gives you a voice and a vote in an organization that's intended to function not as some faceless corporation, but as an extended family of neighbors working together.
All right, Section 2, Defining State Nationals.
So if the assembly is totally voluntary, where do you even start? Well, the texts lay out our first main group, the American State National. They define this as your basic default birthright political status. The documents claim a lot of individuals have been misidentified by systems like birth registration and basically must correct their public records to return to the land and soil of their home state. This right here is the starting point for everyone in this framework.
Reclaiming that status isn't just a given, though. It requires exact criteria. You've got to be at least 21 years old and either born on American soil, naturalized, or meeting some specific residency requirements. To make it official, the texts outline a very specific paperwork process. We're talking about completing a 1779 one-page declaration, providing a copy of your birth certificate, and securing 2 witness testimonies.
So what's actually expected of you once you hold this status? Honestly, surprisingly little. As the source material points out, a state national's main obligation is pretty much just to obey non-statutory public law and keep the peace. You get to enjoy the protection of the state and constitutional guarantees, and you can vote on local county matters, but you really hold no heavy obligation to actively serve. You don't even have to join the assembly if you'd rather not.
Moving right along to Section 3. Defining State Citizens.
Okay, so if a state national is the baseline, what exactly is an American state citizen? The materials describe this as a major step up. It's a highly voluntary, elevated path for a state national who actively chooses to take on more. It's an elected role meant for those who are willing to do the heavy lifting of active self-government, enforce constitutional guarantees, and literally occupy public office.
Now, because you're taking on real power and responsibility here, the eligibility requirements are definitely stricter. You've obviously got to be a state national first and an assembly member in good standing. But the absolutely crucial point is the bottom half of this list: 0 dual citizenship and 0 divided allegiance. The founder's principle that no man can serve 2 masters is heavily emphasized here. A state citizen cannot hold BAR registrations, federal licenses, or have any loyalties to foreign or corporate entities. None.
The documents hit this point over and over again. Singular allegiance. That means your loyalty is exclusively to your specific state of the union. The source material argues that it's exactly this undivided loyalty that qualifies state citizens to go out and handle international business and interstate matters on behalf of their state.
Section 4. Comparing roles and duties. Let's put these two side by side. When we do, you can see a really clear exchange of responsibilities for rights. A state national's voting is limited just to local matters, their obligation is only to keep the peace, and they completely skip jury duty. A state citizen, on the other hand, agrees to the really heavy obligations of running the state government and serving as a state court juror. But in exchange for that service, they're granted the right to vote on international and interstate matters. How does this play out in everyday assembly life? Well, a General Assembly member, meaning a state national, might just go to public meetings and enjoy some community activities. But active self-government, which is the domain of the state citizen, is essentially a second full-time job. We're talking staffing jury pools, serving in the state militia, and managing vital public offices that carry massive financial and security liabilities.
All of this naturally raises a pretty big question. If state citizens hold all the ultimate voting power for international issues, why in the world would anyone choose to remain a mere state national? Well, the source material is surprisingly practical about human nature here.
Most people just have really busy lives. They've got jobs to do and families to raise. They are perfectly happy just keeping the peace locally without taking on the grueling time commitment and strict limitations of a singular, undivided allegiance.
Which brings us to Section 5, Assembly Service and Misconceptions.
So how do all these roles actually interact on a day-to-day basis? First off, the texts firmly and impartially insist that there is only one rightful, lawful assembly in each state. It's not a private club, it's not a corporate hierarchy, and it's certainly not a political party. Rather, it's a community-building effort summoned by the Federation to establish cooperative self-governance.
To actually build that community, the Assembly relies on a few key roles, and the most prominent one is the coordinator. The documents describe coordinators as your administrative organizers, your expediters, your liaisons. Their job is super practical. Pick up the phone, gather people together, help them get their paperwork sorted out, and act as a rallying point for the group. They are educators and peacemakers. They are absolutely not dictators or CEOs.
Now here's a really fascinating structural detail from the documents. A coordinator's actually required to be a state national, and they cannot be a state citizen. No way. Why is that? Because a coordinator operates on assignment for the Federation, which is the instrumentality of all the states combined. If a coordinator were a state citizen, their required singular allegiance to just one specific state would create a massive conflict of interest. Remaining a state national keeps them totally unbiased.
All right, Section 6, Summary and Conclusion.
Let's pull all these complex pieces together. The texts outline a system that's highly interlocked, like a giant puzzle. State nationals form the broad foundation, reclaiming their status and keeping the peace locally. State citizens are the smaller, more dedicated group who voluntarily take on strict loyalties to govern and manage those big interstate affairs. Coordinators act as the administrative glue up at the Federation level, and the ultimate goal uniting every single one of them, cooperative self-governance.
The source materials actually lay down a direct challenge to the reader. They argue that for way too long, people have basically been standing around letting other people govern them. The texts assert that true freedom requires active participation. It means stepping up and taking on the responsibilities of protection and community building, whether you choose to do that broadly as a national or intensely as a citizen.
And that right there is the core of the framework. These differences in rights, allegiances, and obligations between the roles, they aren't just legal trivia. They are literally the engine of this proposed system. It leaves us with a pretty profound question to chew on. If given the choice, how much of the heavy burden of governance would you voluntarily carry in exchange for your freedom? Understanding these distinctions is essential to understanding how the assembly structure is intended to function.